After 8 and time for It's My Story. And this week, Roger Bolton returns to the Cold War and talks to radio engineers about the challenges of broadcasting to the Soviet Union.
Несколько лет тому назад в Лондоне с огромным успехом гастролировал советский театр кукол под руководством Образцова.
On the 10th of August 1960, the man with one of the most famous voices in the BBC Russian service, Anatol Goldberg, sat down in front of the mic and read a talk about puppets. It was no subtle satire, no Animal Farm, but in 1960 even puppets were political. The world was in the grip of a Cold War that pitted communism against capitalism, and broadcasters were on the front line of this ideological conflict. Words could be offensive weapons, and the Soviet Union was determined to prevent its citizens from hearing about dolls.
Его основал почти полстолетия тому назад Витторио Подре. По образованию юрист, по профессии адвокат, журналист, секретарь музыкальной академии и великий кукольник. В Италии, родине Пульчинелло,
The systematic jamming of the BBC's radio language services to Russia and the Eastern Bloc set the corporation's engineers a huge challenge. Broadcasting on shortwave, which involves bouncing radio signals off the ionosphere, the engineers had to find ways of avoiding the jamming and getting the radio signals to their target audience behind the Iron Curtain. In 1956, a young BBC engineer was offered a job as a technical assistant at the transmitter station at Skelton in rural Cumberland, the English equivalent of Siberia. Dennis Thompson joined a team of engineers whose job was to beat the jamming and transmit foreign language programs to listeners in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine and Russia. 50 years later, I went back to Skelton with him.
It does feel a long way from Russia here, doesn't it? I mean, it feels a long way from anywhere, Skelton, but did you feel as very much you're on the outskirts or a long way away from the Cold War, or did you feel you were in the middle of it?
No, I felt I was very much on the periphery until I went to Bush House, and then I was much more aware of the Iron Curtain and the target areas in the Soviet Union.
Now, can we go through here into the... Is this the transmitter halls we're going through?
Yes, we're going into the transmitter hall. There were 6 transmitters in those days, but they were only 100 kilowatts.
And what did that mean in terms of the amount of time or the distance that they could transmit over?
Well, they could still transmit over the same distance. I mean, the distance is really more dependent on the antenna configuration. Sure, with a high-power transmitter you get a stronger signal, but with 100 kilowatts you could still get into the Soviet Union.
And so, at any one time, did you fire the lot of these transmitters up?
Oh yes, there were all 6 going, and there were 12 in Skelton B. So altogether you could get 18 radio frequencies out of Skelton A and B combined.
Sounds like an awful lot of power to me. I mean, did the rest of Cumberland go black while you were doing it?
No, but when you had most of the transmitters operating on a common program, Russian particularly, when you had a lot of transmitters going, then you would modulate the lights.
You say modulate, what? Go down, get much?
Go up and down in brightness in time with whatever speech pattern was coming out of the program.
А теперь предлагаем вашему вниманию программу, которую мы назвали «Турист из ада». У микрофона наш сотрудник Юрий Голигорский.
В начале января 1985 года
Yuri Goligorsky at the microphone with a talk called A Tourist from Hell, broadcast in January 1985. Yuri was, as still is, a stalwart of the BBC's Russian service. He joined the corporation in 1978.
And when you started, or I think round about the time you started to work for the BBC, Georgy Markov was stabbed with an umbrella.
I think it happened just a few days before I officially joined the BIP.
And did you fear for your own safety doing the work you did? Because clearly the last thing the Soviet Union wanted was the sort of thing you were doing to be broadcast within the boundaries of the Union.
We certainly were aware, the people who worked for the World Service, especially for the services broadcasting to the countries behind the Iron Curtain. We couldn't help noticing people of the special branch who sat with us on the same floor after Georgy Markov was killed. But the danger never was a major factor. It's something which people kept at the back of their minds.
Now, if you're broadcasting in the UK, you don't have anything to do as a producer, or not much with broadcasting engineers, but doing what you do, how closely do you have to work with engineers to try and get the programs across?
It wasn't obligatory, but I was always very, very interested in the technical as well as the editorial side of what we've been doing. So I kept in close touch with most of our engineers, asking them how can we contribute, we as producers, as editors, as translators, how are we going to build the jamming system?
Were you able to get instructions across to listeners in the Soviet Union about how to improve their listening equipment?
First of all, we told people that the jamming could be less effective outside bigger cities. We knew it from our engineers, because the jamming stations were situated primarily in the center of big cities and towns. Also, I remember I once did a whole program, on a special, very cheap device, just pieces of wire and pieces of plank glued together, stuck together. But it proved to be a very, very clever device which would separate the jamming signal and the BBC signal. And again, from the anecdotal evidence gleaned from the Soviet Union, we knew that it did work.
Oh, hi, it's Jeff Spells to see Ian Liston-Smith.
I'll unlock it and you can walk through.
OK, thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Jeff. You're getting us into capture. Well, you will in a minute when it opens.
These days, BBC Caversham near Reading is where the BBC monitors foreign language broadcasts. But when Jeff Spells joined the corporation in 1972, there was a second monitoring station at Tatsfield in Kent. So when Skelton in Cumberland transmitted programmes on shortwave, the engineers at Tatsfield checked that those programmes were being broadcast on the right frequency and, crucially, during the Cold War, whether the signals were being jammed.
Part of the job was to identify the possible source of deliberate interference. The Russian jammers would identify themselves by keying Morse code. So you get what we call a Morse marker for each jammer. We would record those so that we could identify whether the same jamming site was being used every day for the same frequency. I can still remember the sheets we used to have to fill in.
Well, we're now in the BBC Written Archive Centre in Caversham, surrounded by dusty files, which doubtless have lots of secrets. What have we got here, Jeff? What's this one?
Well, this one that we're looking at is a report from the Tatsfield monitoring station. This particular report is a management summary of the observations on jamming that have been collected.
And who would get copies of this? Who would get the BBC, to the Foreign Office?
Well, these reports would have gone to BBC External Services, as it was in those days, and would probably have been made available to the Foreign Commonwealth Office.
And where was the most intense jamming coming from?
That would have been from the USSR and its satellites.
I can see here Bulgaria, Russia, Bulgaria. The Bulgarians seem to have been pretty effective. The Ukrainians are involved as well.
Yes, all of the East European languages would have been jammed in those days.
And how effective was it? I mean, presumably you would try and avoid the jamming somehow, by switching frequencies with transmissions and so on. But if they locked onto you, could you hear anything of the original programme?
There would have been periods in the day where they would have had an advantage, but we would try to find a window where we had an advantage over them. The whole of this led to a big power race. The Western broadcasters would increase their transmitter power. This was a period that the BBC tried to increase powers, 250 kilowatt transmitters. Then we started to use some of them coupled together to give 500 kilowatts. And we ended up actually putting in 500 kilowatt units purely to get programs into Eastern Europe.
So it's not an arms race, this is a power race.
It's a power race, yes, because if we could get a strong signal in, it meant that the Soviets had to put in a bigger signal to stop their people listening to it.
Well, we're now in an office just off the monitoring area, and we've got a tape of some of the jamming that went on in the past. Jeff, what are we going to listen to?
Well, the track we've got here is Kol Israel opening up with its interval signal. So that's the interval signal. Most radio stations have a particular tune.
They haven't jammed it yet. They'll be locating it now, the Soviets. And are they going to zap it? Ah.
Yeah, now what that is the jamming transmitter is just tuning up onto the frequency. So you heard the tone that goes to a 0 beat. Okay, and there's another one. But there's no noise jamming as yet. All they've done is to tune the jamming transmitter up onto this frequency. So this is the program. And they've just now turned on the noise generator. So the transmitter, the jamming transmitter would have been tuned on the frequency with no modulation, and then as soon as the program starts they just hit the button to turn on the noise generator.
That's sadism, isn't it?
Yes. Now the next one, this is BBC's Russian service. So the announcement, and then immediately...
That's about 2.5 seconds. They're obviously waiting for it.
And that noise you can hear is the Morse marker. So that identifies the site that's actually doing the jamming.
And it's really unpleasant. I mean, if you've got that switched on, you switched on and off immediately, so they've succeeded.
Yes, indeed. That's the whole point, is to make it so difficult for people to listen to. They'll just give up trying.
The Russians had such a sophisticated jamming network that when you turned the transmitter on, you could hear the jamming transmitter zero in to your frequency. So you would hear a sort of a whistle and then a... and then the jamming would start.
Sounds like waiting for one of those V-bombs in the war.
Yes, and we tried to defeat them by not bringing on the carrier of the transmitter until the last few seconds before we started program. But within 15 seconds they had zeroed in. It was a very clever and well-organised network.
Dennis's respect is well earned. The Russians were nothing if not methodical, and the jamming system that came on stream in 1948 remains the world's most thorough attempt to repel an audio enemy. Rimantas Plekis works for a private relay station, Radio Baltic Waves, in Vilnius, Lithuania. He's also an historian of Soviet jamming.
First of all, the jamming stations were built in the big cities of the Soviet Union, and we know exactly that there were 81 jamming stations starting from Moscow and all capitals of so-called Soviet republics and other big cities in the Soviet Union. But there were also other type of jamming stations, so-called long-range or skywave jamming stations, which used high-power transmitters and directional antennas. So the range of these local jammers, which were installed in big cities, was just 20 or 30 kilometers, but the long-range jammers reached up to 2,000 or even 3,000 kilometers.
So if you wanted to listen from within the Soviet Union to broadcast from the West, how would you do it? Would you go out into the countryside? Would you listen at particular parts of the day?
Okay, I started listening to the Western stations approximately in 1972, when I was maybe 15 or 16 years old. And at that time I lived in small town Druskininkai in the southern Lithuania, and I could listen almost to all Western broadcasts. I remember before going to school at 7:45 in the morning, I listened to the BBC Russian news, and of course the quality was not very good because the distant jamming was heard, but it was possible to listen. And
did you talk to your friends about it, or was it something that you had to keep quiet in case somebody in authority overheard you?
Well, in the 70s and 80s, it was not so very dangerous to listen to these stations. I just listened personally at home, and sometimes I talked with my friends about the content of the Western radio broadcasts. but I was not recording these programs or distributing these programs, and therefore everything was quiet.
Did the Soviet Union ever admit to jamming radio signals during the Cold War?
As far as I know, in the early period, in 1950s, the Soviet Union was not admitting the jamming operations, but later, in the 60s and in the 70s, the Soviet Union admitted that they are jamming Western radio programs, and even they tried to motivate on high political level that they need to do jamming because they need to defend the Soviet population from a hostile Western anti-Soviet propaganda.
And do you think people believed that as an excuse?
I don't think so.
But presumably the jamming stations were visible. So on the one hand, in the early years, the authorities are saying no jamming is going on, but then presumably you could see where the jamming stations were.
Yes, everybody knew where these jamming stations are located because, well, they had a special look with the wire antennas with many vertical dipoles and typical towers. And actually it was a secret which was open for many.
Do you think, looking back, that the fact that they tried to jam all of these programs made those stations even more attractive to young people, be they Russian or Lithuanian?
Yes, I think this jamming made them even more attractive, and the forbidden fruit is always more attractive.
Those forbidden fruits were far from exotic because program makers had to take account of the hostile oral environment. If programs were to be heard through the jamming, it was pointless laying music or special effects under the voices. Much better to keep it simple, as Yuri Goligorsky was doing in September 1984 in a program about pirate radio.
Шарль де Голль пожаловался как-то. Как, спросил знаменитый французский генерал и президент, можно руководить государством, в котором сортов сыра...
You couldn't be very elaborate in your production. The prime and perhaps the only objective was to make sure that the meaning of what you are saying reaches the listener.
And how about the length of programs? I'm supposing you try and broadcast a play or something like that, or for an hour and a half. I mean, could you do that?
Out of the question. The sequences had to be short and repetitive. It wasn't radio in the true sense of the word. It was an information service. It was like a newswire, dry as a bone.
Now, did you have a sense that you were broadcasting into a void? I mean, had you any idea whether you were getting through to large numbers of people?
We had anecdotal evidence. Sometimes we used to get very clever letters, and I will give you an example. For instance, one letter was saying, "Unrespected members of the Russian service, I would like to tell you that last night at 2000 Moscow time, quite by accident, I've listened to your broadcast, which was quite insulting and derogatory to the Soviet system. I couldn't help knocking on the door of my neighbor and ask him, did you hear what the BBC just said? He says, yes, I did hear. We went on the street and met a group of our friends, and before we opened our mouth, they told us, did you hear what insulting broadcast was just made by the BBC? And so on and so forth. And by the end of it, he said, it transpired that unfortunately our entire city heard what you've just broadcast.
Those must have been the most encouraging insults you've ever had.
Fantastic. I mean, that was a very clever message. A, the guy told us that he did like what we were saying, but B, it provided our engineers with some technical information that we knew exactly the frequency and the time and the geographical area.
Foreign listeners weren't the only ones supplying the engineers with invaluable technical intelligence. John Chusa was managing director of the BBC World Service from 1986 to 1992. He frequently went abroad and always took a radio. Whenever he could, he switched on to hear how the BBC was faring in its struggle against the jammers.
Going abroad and travelling with the shortwave radio was terribly important. And I would test all the available frequencies when I was abroad in any particular area. And then I'd come back and I'd give them a report. And I'd say that was very good at 10 o'clock in the morning, much less good at 6 in the evening, and so on and so forth. And I liked all the engineers because they were fantastically professional, single-minded, but very, very professional.
Now, you were obviously aware about the political importance, about the international implications of what you were doing. Do you think the engineers were?
I think the engineers were concerned about the level of the signal and the clarity of the signal. That is what they were for. I never had a political discussion with the engineers, and they didn't initiate one. But without the engineers, nothing would have happened. No signal would have got through. And there was a sense of practicality and actuality about it. You can get very theoretical, and we all did, about the importance of international broadcasting, but the engineers were the practical ones who got the signal there.
Even so, BBC engineers and broadcasters continued to be severely tested by the Russians. They were formidable opponents, and they harnessed science and psychology to create highly effective jamming. Anatoly Batyushkin was a Vice Minister for Communications in the old Soviet Union.
I wouldn't call it jamming. In our country we had a quite different term for it. We called it radio counteraction. To begin with, there were generators that emitted sounds and a sort of buzzing. Then we started using other, more advanced methods. In the end, the most effective one ever invented by our scientists and engineers was a speech-like signal. It made use of the structure of the human ear to create a speech-like sound that distracted the listener's brain so that he couldn't take in the actual information being broadcast by the BBC or Voice of America.
The jamming ended on the 21st of January 1987. Suddenly, BBC programmes could be heard uninterrupted. It was a major policy shift, a consequence of Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost. But it wasn't the end of the jamming story, which now took an extraordinary twist, and fittingly, it was engineers like Denis Thompson who stayed centre stage.
Well, this was in 1990 in Bulgaria, in a ski lodge in Pamporovo. During the Cold War years, the Western broadcasters got together to coordinate our schedules. And the Russians and the East Europeans were doing an exactly similar exercise.
So they had their Warsaw Pact, as it were, of transmitters, and we had our NATO group of transmitters, and we coordinated our battle plans.
Yes, and then at Pamporovo, the Eastern group invited the Western group to join them.
And was the reception a little frosty initially? I mean, how did you break the ice?
We were very much like kindred spirits, and I remember the final evening of that conference. We had a session together with the Russians, particularly in the bar, and they were leaving on the coach to go back to Sofia at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and some of us stayed up to see them onto the coach. And I think this, the ice was melted certainly by then, but I think this shattered it completely.
As a direct result of this Eastern Bloc initiative, an international body was set up, the High Frequency Coordination Conference, to oversee shortwave transmissions. Russian engineers like Anatoly Batyushkin, who'd been involved in Cold War jamming, were delighted to have an opportunity to get to know their Western, colleagues.
You know what? I still feel grateful whenever I think back to Bulgaria and Pamporovo. It was the first time capitalist and socialist radio specialists had met up. And it's with a sense of immense gratitude that I now recall the people I was fortunate enough to meet and work with there. They were superb specialists and splendid people. I can only say how good, how marvelous it was that it was 1991 and the first time we could genuinely understand one another.
Nobody jammed their conversations, and Anglo-Russian understanding took one more extraordinary turn. With a network of radio transmitters now lying idle across the Soviet Union, and the BBC keen to take advantage of the new Russian mood of openness, an audacious plan started to take shape. In 1989, 2 years after the jamming had stopped, Yuri Goligorsky went to the Soviet Union and visited a jamming station.
The jammers didn't know whether they were supposed to kill us, to help us, to give us a cup of tea. I mean, the state was in a state of flux. And it was immediately obvious to me that these people, if they haven't lost their job by now, they would have been jobless very soon, because there was nothing for them to do. And I thought, can't we use these transmitters for something else? Is it technically possible to send our signal to these transmitters and reutilize them? Because if they jammed our signal so effectively, perhaps they will disseminate our signal with a similar degree of effectiveness. And I came back to London with this half-baked, crazy, off-the-wall idea. And we thought, why don't we try?
But then you're asking people who, one moment are trying to jam your signal, the next moment, would you please rebroadcast it?
Correct.
And this is turning on a sixpence, isn't it?
The job is a job. A signal is a signal. Let's do it. And since then, it has been working fantastically well.
Hello, друзья! В непосредственной близости к микрофону Пафнутий Каневский. Сегодня в полетах.
So, the BBC's happy, and the Russian rebroadcasters are as well. In Europe at least, jamming belongs to the past, though elsewhere, in China, North Korea, Cuba and Zimbabwe, foreign radio transmissions are still being jammed. But Cold War warriors, like the radio engineers Dennis Thompson and Jeff Spells, who struggled to get their transmissions into the Soviet bloc, have had their semi-retirements unexpectedly enriched.
I started meeting with the people from the East in 1995. And because we're all engineers, we talk the same language, even though we may not speak the same language. And it's a very businesslike and friendly atmosphere. Everybody's got to know everybody over the years, and we greet each other like long-lost friends.
This group that got together in Pamporovo, there are some very good friendships now between East and West, very close personal ties within this group. If I take the Russians, for example, the BBC always prided itself on having the best frequency managers in the West. But the Russians are certainly on a par, because they were running an absolutely enormous network. And so we're very much kindred spirits, very much allies in that particular instance. The next conference that happens, already I have an invitation to go along and see some of the people there. So maybe I will still keep, if you like, a toe in the pool.
And you'll have a drink or two with them.
We'll certainly have a drink or two together.
It's My Story, Political Interference, was presented by Roger Bolton and produced by John Watkins.